Welcome to the Combat Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Peacock. To end Season 2 with a bang, my guest today is Stuart Armstrong, who is well known in the sports science and skill acquisition community through his podcast, The Talent Equation, which is highly recommended. Stuart thinks of himself as a pracademic, a practitioner with an academic background focused on the practical application of the science of coaching to real-life coaching. We've touched on the constraints-led approach to motor learning quite a bit throughout Seasons 1 and 2, but only in a cursory sense. In this episode, Stuart walks us through more specific ways we can use the constraints-led approach to improve our martial arts training. One of the main breakthrough concepts here I want to direct your attention toward is that Stuart repositions skill development not as knowledge transfer from instructor to student, but as an adaptation to environmental stress. In other words, skill is developed in sufficiently representative practice environments, the same way that muscle grows in response to progressively heavier weight loads from session to session. But in the case of martial arts skills, the load is not weight, but instead challenge to the perceptual system, i.e. your ability to read an opponent, manipulate distance, and properly time your attacks and counters, and so on. I'm extremely excited to share this interview with you. It's challenging, information-dense, and worthy of multiple listens, which is why I saved it to cap off Season 2. As always, if you're excited to jump in, hit the subscribe button on your podcatcher right now and enjoy the ride. So for any of my listening audience that doesn't know you, who are you and what do you do?
So, yes, Stuart Armstrong. I guess you could probably call me a sports development professional by trade. I've been fortunate enough to work in the sports industry for, a bit too long, quarter of a century, 25 years. I actually wanted to be a graphic designer, and then my art teacher at school caught me on the field hockey pitch for the 15th time when I should have been in his class, and he said to me, "You should have a career in sport." And it proved to be the best career advice I ever got. So yeah, I've been into sport all my life. I actually was born with a disability, born upside down, and in lots of ways that's kind of shaped my kind of passion, really, because I basically had a corrective surgery when I was a child, and then I just started involved in sport. And by all accounts, the physical limitations that I was left with meant that I shouldn't really have been able to compete as an able-bodied individual, a fully able-bodied individual. And I did have some sort of athletic limitations.
Sure.
But that in many ways meant that I just had to adapt. And so I became really kind of when your 100-meter time is about 18 seconds at the age of 15, you're never going to be the fastest out there. So I wasn't blessed with speed and pace like others. So you have to become tactically astute. So, I had to think quicker. I had to move the ball quicker. I became a playmaker because I could think ahead of everybody else. I also became quite tactically aware, and I would organize teams around me to sort of make up for my limitations in lots of ways. So that kind of took me on the journey to coaching. It was kind of a natural thing. And so when I was at university, I started coaching there, and I sort of never really looked back. I've been involved in coaching. I've done lots of coaching, sort of at various different levels, international stuff, as well as, kind of national Premier League type level. Nowadays, I've sort of taken a step back from that because I've still got a relatively young family, and all my efforts are basically into helping them hopefully enjoy the experiences of sport and physical activity. So I'm involved in all different sports throughout the year. And then in the day job, I actually work in sports development for a national agency called Sport England. Our aim is to increase physical activity across England. And my responsibility is to support the development of kind of coaches and community leaders and volunteers, and helping their development through all the different sports that we work with, by kind of guiding, hopefully, the way that they improve coach education, coach retention, coach development, coach support packages. So I kind of like coaching, if you like, and so I pretty much live and breathe that world.
That's awesome. That's why I really enjoy listening to your podcast, because you have a perspective on the athletes, obviously, but you also have a perspective on what goes into coaching coaches how to coach better, if you could put it that way.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of different really interesting perspectives on the development of sports. one of the two things that come up on your podcast a lot are what you call the ecological approach and also the constraints-led approach. And I was wondering if you could, for my audience is really, it's combat sports, right? It's martial artists. So
yeah.
The ecological approach or ecology or anything like that is going to be foreign to 99.9% of all of them. So I was wondering if you could kind of go over what the ecological approach is.
It's interesting. I seem to be spending a lot of time in the kind of combat sports space. I actually did a community of learning session for a group of boxing coaches on a couple of days ago.
Oh, wow.
So so I'm sort of I'm in the combat sports realm quite a bit at the moment, which is great. So there's a group of coaches from England boxing actually who convene this community of learning. So there's some interest in this space. Right. So how to sort of put ecological dynamics or ecological approach and constraints-led approach into a relatively short explanation. I'll do my best. As anybody who has listened to my podcast knows, I'm not the best at short explanations, but I'll do my best. I guess ecological approach basically stems from, or at least in part is based on, I guess a viewpoint around how do human beings learn to do anything. And it's sort of historically over millennia, if we go back in time into, the days of, prehistoric times or whatever, how do human beings learn things? Now, and traditionally the way it's done, the way people learn things is they're put in a situation where they are required to adapt. And the idea is that the environment or the situation or the context that you're in asks you, if you're trying to perform a task, asks you to perform a task in a certain way. And as that environment changes, the dynamics of the task that you're trying to perform change. And so your adaptability defines your ability to perform. And in prehistoric times, that was probably defined how you survived. In a sporting context, it defines how you perform. And so the ecological approach is sort of, there's a branch of psychology, what's called ecological psychology, different forms of psychology, obviously. Some are based around, the cognitive psychology, if you like, is based around the brain and the role that the brain plays in performance, and is based on some principles around the idea that the brain is, if you like, the central governor and defines all movement, which is one explanation for movement. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong, I'm just saying it's one explanation. Mm-hmm. Ecological psychology looks at it slightly differently, and it says that there is an organism, and in this case it's a human being, who is continuously interacting with its environment. And how the environment changes defines how the organism responds. Well, what does that mean for the purposes of coaching and skill acquisition? Well, if you take a combat sport environment, a lot of combat sports sort of historically have been based around, and not just combat sports, but all sports for that matter, have been based around a sort of predominant paradigm, which is that if you develop movement patterns and you do them with enough repetition, they become ingrained in a kind of a cognitive process and also, muscular process. You hear for terms like muscle memory, which is a bit of a myth because muscles don't have memory. Mm-hmm. But the idea is if you repeat a movement pattern enough times, you then are able to become proficient or expert at that movement pattern. And if you have enough movement patterns, you then become expert at, or you become skillful. The ecological approach contests this idea. And it says that actually development of movement patterns is valuable if you're in a very, very static and stable environment. But if you're in an environment that's dynamic, where, for example, there might be opponents or an opponent might do things that are unexpected, your movement patterns need to be able to adapt to those responses. So it's basically saying the environment determines how you should act, how you should move, how you should respond. And so if you're going to learn to become skillful, you need to learn to become skillful in that environment, because the process of skillfulness is one of adaptation. And so the ecological approach suggests that we must have an environment continue in order to become a skillful performer, particularly in those dynamic contexts. Mm-hmm. And so if you imagine a skill acquisition process. Traditionally, the way we've learned to do skill acquisition is you learn a movement pattern and then you apply it in the context and you become skillful. Ecological approach works the other way, which is to say there's an environment that asks questions of you and requires you to move in certain ways, and it's constantly dynamic and varied, and you then must respond to that environment to become a skillful performer, which might mean that you have to then develop movement patterns, but it's working backwards and across rather than a linear process of going from technique towards performance. So that's kind of the ecological approach. We can probably come on to constraints-led approach a little bit later because it'll probably build onto that conversation. But that's the sort of ecological approach in a nutshell. And I imagine there's a few more questions you might want to probe me on.
Yeah, for sure. So that's if you're new to motor learning, skill acquisition, all those types of motor control, those types of subjects, it can be kind of hard to digest all of that. So I think basically, if I could rephrase that, what you're saying is the environment is interacting with you. It's kind of telling you what you need to do, how you need to act as a mover, and then as you become more skilled working in those types of environments, you're able to recognize and kind of create movement solutions to respond to those things in the environment better.
100%. And I tell you a really good live example of that at the moment, actually, in the world of MMA, in UFC.
Sure.
There's a lot of conversation going on about the fact that they're in a smaller octagon.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what does that do for example, people who like to move and, kind of avoid contact, but then be like counter strikers, or people who are trying to avoid, kind of takedowns, things like that. When you're in a smaller octagon, you've got less escape routes. And so that's a factor. And so that's a real example. The environment's different because of the space that you've got that's available. But then there's a lot of other factors in an environment as well. So space is one, but also, what the opponent does to constrain space or to move in order to limit your possibilities to utilize your game plan or whatever it is that you've got within your skill set or your individual capabilities. And another live example, again, UFC is, there's a what you might call super fight, wasn't there, recently with Miocic Cormier, and I just remember watching that fight and just screaming at the TV, thinking, Cormier, like, you're a world class wrestler. Why haven't you tried to take it to the ground once? It was just crazy. It was quite an interesting thing. I don't want to necessarily get into the weeds of that, but it just meant, for me, it was a bit like, why aren't you utilizing the information that's being presented to you in a certain way to be, so a slightly more skillful performer, I think, may have made those sorts of decisions. Anyway, I'll let you respond to that.
No, I think my listening audience will be eating that up because a lot of them are MMA fans, I'm sure. And but like, even from, so I have all kinds in my audience. So there's MMA, there's like the self-defense people, and then there's like the traditional martial arts. So there's all these like little tribes inside of martial arts, and to some degree they're all plagued by a traditional understanding of like an information processing understanding, linear pedagogy type of understanding of motor control and motor learning. So like and I think this is the case with traditionally in boxing as well, but I know that it coming up in a more like a taekwondo karate type of background, that we started by doing our moves in the air, totally decoupled from any type of specifying information, totally from the environment. And you kind of made your way up to targets, and then eventually down the road, you made it to a partner in a sterile environment, nothing that's live, nothing that's actually providing performance context type of dynamics, and then way down the line, sometimes you end up sparring, where you actually get the performance environment. And for some reason, despite the fact that we get this, we come to this point. I know this is, for most of the people I've talked to that have come up through traditional martial arts, they kind of felt this. You go through all these grades of decoupled, I guess you could say, or lack of a performance environment, and then you finally get to the performance environment and everything you're learning suddenly breaks because all of the important skills like timing and controlling space and directing your attention to the right places at the right time, you haven't been building those skills at all. So, and I know you've talked a lot about traditional approaches to skill acquisition versus more of an ecological approach. So I was wondering if you could speak to why it is that sometimes a very traditional gradual approach to skill acquisition is less desirable than maybe an ecological approach.
Well, there's a number of things, I suppose. So, I mean, as a starting point, the example you use is a really good one, because quite a lot of us, either as coaches or as participants or performers, have had that experience, haven't we? We've done all the training, we've done all the movements, we've followed the path, and then we get to the performance environment and it completely breaks down and you're completely lost and you're all at sea and you don't know what's going on and it's pure survival mode. Mm-hmm. Well, if we've all had that experience, either as a performer or I remember as a coach, I coach team sport, and I remember as a coach having my team, and we were I used to do loads of highly repetitive, kind of almost like rehearsal stuff, right. Almost like trying to create like an organized dance, right? Where we'd be moving from there to there to there. And we were really, really organized. And it actually worked, right? Because most teams aren't very well organized. And if you're a bit more organized than the other team, in general, you can be more successful than them. So, we had a good plan and we had a good structure. The problem was when something happened that was unexpected, or a team had a slightly different game plan that we weren't prepared for, or, for example, something unlucky happened that meant we had to sort of chase and we weren't able to stick to our game plan, it just fell apart. Mm-hmm. And I just remember spending countless hours on sidelines screaming and shouting instructions in a desperate attempt to try and resurrect the situation. But in reality, it was gone. It was out of control. We'd lost it. And it was only through, I suppose, some of these bitter experiences that, as a coach, you start to search for answers, don't you? And you look around yourself, you look into yourself as well. And I was fortunate enough that I've been very fortunate in my career to be kind of introduced and exposed to a range of different sort of mentors and support people who've been able to kind of change my perception and introduce me to alternative conceptions. And then, of course, that then sends me on a rabbit hole and I start researching and I start really digging into this stuff. And what happened was, I started searching for something else. I got some little clues and I got some different ideas and I started to experiment with them. And then I started to find the science that then actually started to back up what I was actually trying to experiment with myself as information became more available, And I discovered this body of research. I was like, oh, where have you been all my life? That could have solved a whole load of pain for both me and all the participants that I've worked with. So fundamentally, one of the advantages is it stops you having a whole load of pain. The second, a major advantage for me, is that it's recognizing that human beings are absolutely fabulous learners, right? Right. There is a reason, for any formal training of movement patterns existed and was codified. Human beings developed these movements themselves without a great deal of, kind of tutelage, if you like, Right. And it's because we are exquisitely adaptable. We are adaptation, machines. But as sports become kind of more science-ified, and what I mean by that is the hard sciences have got involved, biomechanics and everything else. What's starting to happen is, it sort of increasingly become like this. The influence has come in that it's basically that you kind of need to look at the world through the perspectives of optimal movement, and that became a really dominant paradigm as our capability for analysis of optimal movement became, slow motion video capture, video itself, 3D movement analysis, and all these force plates, all sorts of different things started to emerge. And we got really attracted by that really hard science stuff because it's empirical in nature, and our kind of, I guess, our predominant narrative has become increasingly empirical. And so we started to look at this hard science, and it became really exciting, and we became quite drawn to it. And so as we start to get more drawn into that kind of hard science, and we start to look at video, it draws us into this idea that the more we can develop optimal movement patterns, the more skillful we can become. What the ecological, I guess, community is arguing is actually there is a much more natural approach to this that we could take, which could, if we're skillful enough, help us to be able to look at the way human beings can develop. Now, I'm not saying we don't use all the information through video, etc., but we're going to use that information in a different way. It's not to create optimal movement patterns. It's to allow individuals to move optimally given a certain set of circumstances. And that's like a fundamentally different way of thinking about things.
Yeah, definitely. And it was really difficult for me to eventually get to wrap my mind around it, because everything I read about, I was trying to relate back to kind of basically the way we're all sort of programmed growing up through school and through college and everything is very, very traditional ideas about instruction and highly structured in curriculums and syllabi and things like that. So it seems to me like that the ecological approach, or like an ecology conception of learning and teaching martial arts, is going to have, the implications are that you really need to try and build exercises. I know you hate the word drill.
Yeah.
I also hate it too, because in the martial arts, everyone means something totally different. You know, when a wrestler says drill, they mean something more like something that's more alive with interaction. And when like a jiu-jitsu or a traditional martial arts guy says drill, they mean like, sterile reps, right? Like dead reps, like compliant reps. So,
yeah.
But like the exercises actually need to include the dynamics of the performance context. It needs to be like the game. It needs to be like the fight. And I know that when I've, like, my reaction to that was like, how in the world are you supposed to learn, right? And I know that whenever I first posed this to other instructors, even instructors from more functional martial arts like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or kickboxing or something like that, they're almost scandalized. They're like, how in the world are you supposed to learn anything if you start out live? So I was wondering if you could speak to, and this might actually be moving more into the constraints-led approach, if you want to speak to that, how you actually approach really start when teaching somebody, the skill acquisition phase when they're first learning a skill, how you really teach them by really allowing them to play the game to some sort of extent.
Yeah, I mean, you used a really important word, which when you said like the fight, and the important word is like. It doesn't have to be the full thing, because actually that's something that when I've been speaking to kind of other combat sports practitioners, they quite often say, "Well, hang on a second, there's safety. You can't just go get in your head." Get your head kicked in every week, because there's an issue around safety and well-being and all these sorts of things, which is absolutely correct. So the point is that, and the term that we use within the community, I suppose, is they call representativeness, and they talk about the idea of representative learning design. And the idea is that you're trying to represent the real life experience. Now, it may mean that you take a slice of it. I like this sort of conceptualization. So you don't do a whole fight. You might just do a slice. You might take a component of the fight. And what you're trying to do is to make the learning of the whatever the movement might be, or whether it's a kind of tactical component, you're making it representative of, as representative as you can, given the constraints of safety, etc., etc., in order to then enable a performer to then respond to something. What you're always looking for is some response. And I spoke to an MMA coach some time ago on the show, who actually used a really good phrase, and they said that actually, if you learn the movements without the possibility of response, actually you're potentially learning to be quite reckless. So, for example, if you learn an attack move without the idea that something could be coming back at you while you go in, well, the danger is then you go into that attack move and then something does come back at you, and you find out pretty quickly that that's something you need to really think about. So actually your attack moves need to be considered from the perspective of what the potential consequences of that going wrong are. So that's where the attunement comes in. So skillful performance is about moving, but also perceiving while moving. So you're always considering that element. Now, it doesn't mean it has to be done full speed. It could be done in slow motion. You could do it using a range of different constraints, and this is where the constraints-led approach comes in, that can make it so that individuals move in a different way that brings about more safety. So, for instance, I've seen a lot of kind of combat training where they're using kind of really oversized gloves that I assume do two things. One is slow the punch movements, and also mean that it's got far less impact when it actually lands. So, for example, that is an example of a constraint, an equipment constraint that A means safety, and B, because it slows down the hand movement, it gives the person on the sort of receiving end, if you like, look that means that it's not fully like it would be in a bout, but it's got some element of representativeness. Now that's going into the full bout world, right? But you could do lots of conditioned bouts, and for example, in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, there's a lot of that, where you're starting in a station. It's almost like a puzzle you've got to solve of how do you get to a certain position from that position, and or a dominant position, so it's not a full bout. It's just part of a bout. You're not trying to get submissions every single time, but you're trying to get positions, and so you're designing learning experiences to allow people to explore movement possibility. So just circling all the way back to what you were saying about how some people are affronted, how could you possibly learn live? Well, again, it's based on this idea that movement solutions are become a much more powerful thing when they're situated. So, for example, if you and I were in the middle of some sort of, kind of altercation, so to speak,
sure,
and you move in a certain way that I can't stop or I can't counter, I've learned something. I've discovered something about my movement repertoire. And so I might then utilize a coach to help me with a possible range of opportunities to counter. But ideally what happens is the coach would work with me to discover what the movement repertoire might be based on my individual capabilities, how I'm perceiving that movement. As opposed to what would traditionally be done, which is the coach would say, there's a problem. I'm going to come in now and tell you how to solve that problem by giving you this movement solution. Apply the movement solution well, and you will be able to counter the problem. Again, it's a sanitized version. The movement solution might work, but it might not work if the other person adapts to that movement solution. So we're trying to take that dynamic interplay between performer and opponent, and we're working with that as a means by which to define how movement solutions might be. And that depends on me. So the way I'm interacting with the way you're moving, I might say to a coach, well, what I'm picking up is that they're moving in this way. And if the coach says that's interesting, in that case, then you might want to, there might be something to explore here. So one of the things that they tend to do in an ecological approach is they don't give the solution. They draw attention to where the information is that might help you find a solution. And that's like a fundamental, it places the learner or the person, the performer, is in the center of the learning process, discovering things, and the coach facilitating the learning experience, as opposed to the coach just being the provider of the solution.
Right. So yeah, with the coach being the provider of the solution. So I guess that's an interesting point. One that I've been feedback and like coaching feedback and instruction's been something I've been thinking a lot about. And you've had quite a few episodes over the last year, kind of diving into a ecological / constraints led approach to coaching. And like, what I've found in martial arts is that most instructors, and I was this way too, um, they view good instruction as just copious amounts of specific, hard instruction about what you should and shouldn't do in a just a mountain of different if then type of scenarios. And I wrote an article for a gym management software company called Martial Arts on Rails, where I kind of dove into the idea that maybe we should challenge the idea that good instruction is made up of so much detailed information, and that maybe we should reconsider instruction, or coaching rather, more as a way to help children and adult students problem solve, and to help them direct their attention to where they need to direct their attention. And I know your podcast has been really helpful to me on that point. I was wondering if you could speak to applying the ecological / constraints led approach to change the way that you instruct and coach.
Right, yeah, that's interesting. So, well, one of the things that it does first and foremost is it takes you as the coach. You're far more out of the picture. So, if we understand that human adaptation and attunement to environment and information in the environment acts as a route by which an individual or an organism can adapt and create kind of new movements and behaviors or whatever it might be. And if we recognize that as being the predominant thing, well, the minute you step in with your ideas and your technical knowledge and your solutions, you're robbing the individual of the opportunity to discover that by attuning to the information. Because you're taking, why would they need to? Because there's somebody here who knows stuff, who can tell me what to do. They don't need to perceive it particularly. They just look to this person on the side with the knowledge to tell them, give them the answer. You get very passive learners then. And you get learners kind of are, very, very much, there's a lot of dynamics there because, and I totally understand it, because lots of people, coaches in particular, that's in theory what they're paid to do. Give them the information. And if you're not giving them the information, you're seen or perceived to be not coaching. Well, I'm going to suggest that, and if I'm doing coach development activity and I go and observe a coach, the first thing I look at is what is the ratio of information flowing from the coach to the participant versus the other way around. And if the ratio is inverse, as in the coach is giving more information, then for me, then there's fundamental, and they want to work within a kind of ecological framework. Fundamentally, there's a problem, because the more information flowing from coach to learner or coach to performer basically means then that the performer is really not in the center of the learning process. They're a recipient of information, and they're trying to interpret that information into some sort of performance action. Also, what you'll often find is you'll find a lot of quite frustrated coaches who give a lot of information and a lot of instruction, but then see not what they're giving the information to do, what they're sort of the instructions they're giving not being performed, getting quite frustrated at the fact that the individual is not responding to that. And part of that is to do with the fact that the individual is taking what is an abstract concept delivered in the form of language, and they're trying to interpret it to the live environment that they're in, or the environment that they're in, whether it's live or not. Well, it is a live environment because they're in. And their interpretation of that information, and then what that then means for them in terms of movement performance, can obviously vary wildly. because of this issue between movement and abstract cognitive concepts that come in the form of language.
Mm-hmm.
So then sometimes you use demonstration, sometimes you use physical manipulation. And all of these things are governed by A, how the performer perceives the information, and B, how they then physically are able to adapt to that. And it's kind of a very difficult dynamic for somebody to deal with. See, I've got somebody telling me this thing, I'm doing what I think they're telling me, but they're shouting at me saying it's wrong. I actually don't know what right is anymore. And that's like a really horrible situation to be in as a coach and as a performer, right? So that means for then the experience is like really not good for anybody. And like, so why would you want to persist with that? And the assumption then from the coaches, because they've got no other tool, nothing else in their toolbox, the only thing they can do is give more information or do more demo, whatever it is. And the performer still doesn't get any better. So what happens in an ecological, not necessarily in there that much at all, apart from maybe to pose questions or maybe to change the dynamics of the environment. What you're seeking to do, and what I often do, is I change the environment so that something in the environment has changed, to then see how the performer adapts to the environment change. So, for example, if, let's say, I had two performers in front of me and one was working on some sort of defensive movement whilst the other one was then putting different attacks. If I was to say to the person who is on the attack, I want you to attack in a certain way, without telling the person who's learning about the defensive movement, what I would then look to do is to see, A, how the person doing the defensive movement responds. And then I would work with the defensive movement to find out what they're seeing happening in the attacker, to see if they're picking up the various things that the attacker is now doing that might have changed in the environment, to then discover with them what it is they might do, if they do observe it, by the way, to change it. So one way I might change the environment is to give an opponent a different task to see how the other opponent responds. Or another way I might change the environment, for example, might be to constrain the space that's available, to then see how that individual might respond to the fact that the space has changed. And it then means that they've got limited options in terms of evasion, let's say. So, sorry, I've gone a bit of a long-winded rant there. But so my point being is, just to sort of summarize that, is when you work ecologically, you're thinking much more about how you can change the environment, or discovering through questioning how the performer is perceiving changes in the environment, than you are thinking about giving them solutions. In fact, you very, very rarely give solutions, which is a challenging thing for some coaches, particularly when they've got a lot of information they want to give or expertise to provide. Your ego out of the equation, because it's the learner learning that matters. Now, it might mean eventually that if the learner is really, really struggling, that you may then need to provide some clues, or even provide a movement solution, because they're just not quite getting there and they really, really need your help. But that comes far later in the learning process than it would in a traditional model where it's right at the start.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Very excellent. So you said it, I think really to summarize that, you're saying that you as the coach, you enter into what's going on in the environment to help to first understand how it is that the learner is perceiving the environment, and then to sort of help direct them, not explicitly, but maybe by asking questions, help nudge them towards where they should be putting their attention, and or help them actually understand their own emerging problem solving process. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, dead on. And what's important about that as well is that the types of question you might use, for example, because ultimately what I'm interested in is how is this individual or group of individuals living their environment? Because I can only change it and manipulate it. And, I like to think of it sometimes as like a photograph, and, in the aperture in a camera, like it focuses the light in such a way that it becomes quite the picture then becomes a more you're getting a stronger image because the light is coming into the lens in a certain way. It's a similar idea. you're sort of constraining the environment in such a way that, almost like there's this beam of light that's information that's sort of almost like, in theory, hitting the performer between the eyes, right? And then they're not seeing all the other stuff, all the other noise that's there. They're just seeing this thing, and you go, and then they begin to focus in on that thing, and then they begin to respond to it. It can be quite challenging to do, because you often find that you constrain in a way that you think is absolutely got in this beam of light, and they're just not picking up on it. So then you find yourself a bit like, so the important thing for me though is that I'm always really responding, or always interested in how is the performer interacting with the environment, what information are they taking. So like one of my favorite questions is, what did you notice? Because in my mind, there's no wrong way to answer that apart from to say, I didn't notice anything. Well, you must have noticed something. Were you asleep? So my view is that I want to know what you're noticing. What are you noticing? Are you noticing anything? And it's very important to do that, because in the past, what I've done is I used to use questions, because it's good to use questions. You hear, on the coaching courses, use questions. But I would use questions basically just to get them to find my solution. I've got a solution. Yeah. It's like the coach guessing game, right? I've got a solution in my mind. I want you to guess it. I'm going to ask you some questions. And then you just literally, the athlete just like tries to list as many things as possible in the vain hope that they're going to stumble across the thing the coach has got in their mind. Good. Well done. Yes, you've got it right. I don't do that anymore. I use a much more divergent approach, right? I'm not trying to get them to my answer. I'm purely and simply using questions to elicit information from them, which might tell me or give me clues as to the way they're interacting with the environment, which then means I can either help them focus on a particular area by a further question. So I'll quite often pose a question as a means to focus attention. I might say, what do you notice? And I say, well, I noticed that when my leg moves here, their leg is going there. Okay, that's really interesting. All right. Now I want you to pay attention then. The only thing I want you to pay attention to is when you move your leg, where exactly do their leg move to? And then we do the action, we come back, and then we're learning something and we're discovering something. So my response to the athlete is always based on what they're giving me. So very rarely now am I coming to them with a solution in mind. I might have one, but I'm holding that back right until the last minute. I'm waiting for them, because if their perception's somewhere else, then I'll go with that. I'll follow where the energy is.
Right. Yeah. I remember. I wish I had this tool. A couple years ago, I used to teach for a nonprofit karate program that's kind of nationwide. And what they do is they offer they set up in areas that are low income and kind of offer a way for students and their parents to afford to take karate lessons, but it's really just 1 or 2 classes a week. And the program was extremely linear, extremely traditional, and you don't learn this technique until you get to this level, right? And then you don't even start sparring until you're 2-3 belts down the road, which could be 6 months. It could be almost a year, because it's a fairly slow program, because you only can practice maybe once or twice a week. And what I found was, when the students actually began to spar, what they would do was toss out random combinations that they were taught. And they would almost never make contact with their partners. And they just couldn't figure it out. They couldn't figure out why it was that they would be tossing out all of these punches and kicks, and they even start trying to move forward and this and that, and they just weren't making contact. And I wish that I could have just set them aside and been like, ask them a question about, what happened? Why do you think that kick didn't land? Why were you throwing that back fist even though your jab didn't even land? Like, did you feel like you were in range at that point? Like, what was going through your mind when you made that decision? And I never, I didn't have that back then, but I understand now that it wasn't that they were just unskilled. They were skilled enough at the techniques themselves, but they had spent so much time in the striking in the air and on bags, that they had no perceptual motor skill for any of those techniques. They didn't understand how to close and manipulate distance. They didn't understand timing. They didn't understand how to control their techniques based on the information in the environment. So when I got in there, and I'm not the best sparrer, I kind of came up through the same thing, and it wasn't until much later that I began to actually, get more of that good type of training. But when I got in there, I can make contact and then be out of range in a second. And they got so frustrated that some of the older students, would get angry, right? And they would try to bull rush me, which you're not supposed to do in karate. But I wish I could have just been kind of like a therapist and step back and like, hey, why'd you get upset? Like, because I couldn't hit you and you kept hitting me, and I just couldn't figure out what was going on. And then I could say, well, how come you couldn't hit me? And kind of just get them thinking about what was going on and maybe where they needed to direct their attention. So, I mean, I guess I got off on a long tangent now too, but that's one of those situations where when you keep somebody out of the performance environment so long and everything is so artificial, the training methods are so artificial that you really hurt them in the long run. Like, how are they supposed to, if they can't spar, like, how are they supposed to use that stuff to defend themselves? And it's
and that's one of the challenges as well, isn't it? Because like a lot of this stuff is a lot of martial arts teaching is designed around self-defense in some cases, isn't it? But then, if somebody actually does get into a difficult situation and yet all they've learned is sort of isolated, sanitized technical movements, the whole thing just falls apart under the pressure of somebody acting to cause them physical harm. And loads of people have probably had that experience. And so for me, that's a big concern I would have, is that, you're in some cases where these things are presented as a self-defense thing. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to be disparaging, because I think there's a lot of value in some of that stuff, right? Which is because some of it's about personal discipline. Some of it's about, the commitment it takes to sort of, kind of follow the patterns and all those sorts of things. And I get there's a load of ancillary benefits. But if it's being sold as a means to develop combat skill for whatever purpose, well, it's sort of a little bit lost. Yeah. And I'm not saying necessarily either, by the way. I'm not necessarily saying that, that the movement skills can only be derived from, for example, the kind of the interaction. I mean, you may need to do some I'm going to call it semi-isolated, right?
Yeah.
Semi-isolated movement learning, because actually in a bout, you don't learn the movements particularly because you're too busy in survival mode. So I'm not saying that this has to happen that way. What I'm trying to say is that the idea of learning a load of movements in isolation, then trying to translate them into what is a very dynamic context is, really quite limited in its application. And instead, what we should do is be thinking about, let's take our direction from the dynamic context as a means by which to direct people's learning, which is and I also get this, right? It's a very difficult paradigm, because for a lot of people, that's like, karate in particular, which I did as a child, is based on volume. The business model is based on volume. So you've got a lot of people who, need 30 people in a class to make it run viably. And the only way you can do 30 people in a class is to get them to all follow a load of movements. And I'm not saying that's wrong, right? But that's different, right? That's basically, this is where I sound a little bit disparaging, that's basically more akin to dance, or it's an exercise class. Right. It's a form of exercise, and in itself, absolutely great. But let's just say that that's what it is, though. Let's not dress it up as developing, kind of combat skill, because combat skill is something else entirely. And to become a great fighter, you will need to fight people, and you will need to probably start from that perspective and work backwards.
A lot. You will have to fight them a lot.
Well, anybody who is absolutely expert or at the top of their game has done it a lot, haven't they?
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned kind of like there is some value to more traditional ways of instruction. So I'm wondering, like, how can you when do you know, or when do you feel like it could be beneficial to revert to a traditional way of instruction? Do you think that maybe it's kind of, so you start them in the environment kind of coupled with that information, and then if they're everything that you're trying from a constraints-led approach is really not working very well, is that when you kind of step back a little bit? And hey guys, real quick before the episode continues, if you're wondering how you can supercharge your training in a way that helps you actually perform better on the mat or in the ring, I've got the perfect thing for you. I've taken the scientific concept known as transfer of learning and distilled it down into a handful of dead simple, easy to understand rules you can use to supercharge your training today. And the best part is that it almost always makes training more fun, not less. Now you don't have to spend hours and hours of drilling just to fail when your practice gets tested in sparring or competition. Instead, you can take these simple rules and transform your drills and exercises into rapid skill-building machines. Your classmates and training partners won't believe your progress. And if you're an instructor, your students will get better faster than ever and have more fun while doing it. Go to combatlearning.com/transfer to sign up to our email list and grab your transfer cheat sheet now. Plus, you'll never miss an episode and get access to exclusive tips. And just to say thanks, I'll send you my Introduction to Motor Learning for Martial Arts PDF so you can get up to speed on the powerful concepts we're discussing on this podcast. So go to combatlearning.com/transfer now to get your cheat sheet and other goodies. That's combatlearning.com/transfer, TRANSFER. Make it.
Yeah, I mean, so let's take a real practical example, because I think it's important to be practical. So let's say you're learning to do a leg kick, right? Mm-hmm. Something like that. Mm-hmm. There's probably different ways of doing a leg kick. Like, sure, there's probably a way of doing it that doesn't break your foot for a kickoff, but also there's ways to do leg kick that give you the power, right? But of course, with everything is an opportunity cost, right? So the more power you put into a leg kick, the more vulnerable you are to a counterpunch, probably. And this is where my kind of lack of combat sport expertise comes in. But, notionally, in my mind, this is kind of how things work. If I give everything I've got into a leg kick, the chances are that it's also then going to make me sort of more vulnerable to somebody coming back to me with some sort of counter of some kind. Yeah. And so you've got to find the optimal. And it's got to cause maximal damage, for example, but it's also got to be effective enough that it's not going to leave you too vulnerable to the other consequences. Right. And also it's got to be disguised enough. It's also got to be able to be thrown, but also in combination with other things. So it can't just be thrown in isolation. It's got to be thrown and then potentially with either a defensive movement or another attacking movement on top of it, right? So there's loads of different components to this. But the core element we're trying to discover is the idea of, leg kicks, right? And what they might be. Now, for you and me to just go at it, smashing each other in the thigh, that's not going to last very long, right? So and also it's probably not brilliant for our training capabilities and our health. So we're probably not joining each other. But then the other thing is like to just go against like a heavy bag and just kick a heavy bag a lot. Well, my challenge would be to say, well, actually, the opposite isn't necessarily going to help you any better, because you go kick a heavy bag as hard as you can, the heavy bag's not going to hit you back. So what I would need to do is to try and find a way of saying, well, how can I train doing a leg kick, right, on something that can move, but also something that could do something back to me that I would need to respond, so that I can start to attune to the idea of how a leg kick should be executed in a more live environment. Right. So what we might, for example, do is have you in a padded suit of some kind, moving, and maybe with some kind of a padded rod of some kind. I don't know what it might be, right? That is your kind of counter jousting stick or something. I'm really making this up, but you know what I mean? Yeah. Right? You have to go with my flight of fancy for a second, right? So this leg kick comes in, and if it's not executed quickly enough, then with a defensive movement that stops you then you're going to joust this person in the head with this padded jousting stick, right? So that the individual's learning to kick, and they're also learning to dodge a counter, right? Well, that's really skillful performance, that, isn't it? And we're going to explore that for a bit, right? It's safe because you're padded and there's a padding thing coming back. But we're really learning about a leg kick in something like a real environment. So we're going to use the fact, there's a group of us here, by the way, we're in this activity. We're going to set this activity up. We're going to be a bit creative in our learning design. And so that's not really like about, right? Because there's not the pure terror and peril of about in there. But we're still learning it with a degree of realism or representativeness. And so we're going to do something then that is going to help you to become a more skillful performer, because what we've done is we've taken an isolated movement and we've wrapped around it some safety elements, but also some additional components, which means that we're going to learn to move in a way that is closer to what is likely to happen in a bout than a purely isolated thing like kicking a heavy bag.
Right. Yeah. And that's something I've been working through too, especially from in the martial arts community. People, there's the tiers, right? There's the traditional martial arts and there's the functional martial arts. And most people are like, yeah, boxing, kickboxing, Muay Thai, those are all like the functional martial arts. So everything we do in that is by extension, kosher. It's good. But I've raised some, and this has not been met well, by the way. I've raised some concerns about the lack of representativeness in bag work and mitt work, because in mitt work, you're moving the wrong shoulder and the wrong arms when you present the correct mitt to do mitt work. So the person that's doing the mitt work is learning to respond to the wrong specifying information for like a jab or a cross, right? So, maybe not in all cases, but in a lot of cases, that's it. And then there's also the fact that you're calling out numbers, so it's like you're not. Some of your attention is split between the specifying information and just an arbitrary declarative piece of information. And then with the bag, it moves, so you kind of have to adjust distance if you're doing bag work correctly, but like you said, there's no response. So you don't have to worry about not kicking so hard that you leave yourself vulnerable. So like with leg kicks, you're right. There is a way that, like, if you put all your power into a leg kick and you misjudge the distance, or he moves too much, you could put yourself on the ground, or you leave yourself open to be swept because your leg, rotates way too much. And it's happened in MMA, and it's happened in karate. You can do that in karate. You can sweep somebody who overkicks. It happens all the time in Muay Thai. So if all you're doing is power kicks, right, then you're not going to understand that sort of hidden aspect of the performance context where you actually, most of the time, you don't want to put full power into your kick because you're going to overextend yourself and end up either taking yourself out because of the momentum or opening yourself up to something else. And that's something that coaches in those areas implicitly understand or intuitively understand. But when it comes to making it declarative in terms of what they're coaching, sometimes there's a blind spot there. There's like a disparity between what it is that they know if you toss them in the ring and what it is that they teach. Especially, I see this really in Taekwondo. People talking about the evolution of Taekwondo with Olympic sparring. They lament the fact that it doesn't look as powerful as it did in the 90s and the 2000s. But what they do is they say, well, I teach the power dynamic, right? We kick to hurt, and that's what we do. Never mind the fact that even in the 90s and the 2000s that you still couldn't kick full power every time you did it because you would run out of energy, first of all, and because the person could move, right? And you could slip and fall because of that, or over rotate, all those different things that I just mentioned. And I sit here and I listen to these guys and like, yeah, we do the real Taekwondo from back in the day. And I'm like, well, but if you were in a sparring match, you wouldn't be doing all that. So you're teaching your students the power first, power only Taekwondo, because you're being reactionary towards this new meta in Taekwondo competition, but you know implicitly that's not how it, like, that's not a prudent way to approach it, a match strategically.
Yeah, I mean, you make a number of very good points that probably need to be pulled apart.
Go ahead.
I'm not surprised, by the way, that I'm not surprised that the kind of bag work stuff is, or the pad work is like, you're getting some negative responses. But partly that's due to the fact that the old adage of, if the only tool you've got is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
Right.
And, people haven't necessarily got a framework or a way of thinking about skill development, and therefore, a toolbox like the constraints-led approach to help them to conceive of ways in which they might help a performer with a movement problem. What they've got is the traditional techniques that, are tried and tested, and someone comes along and actually says might not be the best way to develop skill, and you're going to get some negative response, because you're basically saying to people, everything you're doing is, maybe you need to question. Now, in my mind, that is one of the marks of great coaching. Great coaches are continuously looking for new solutions and ideas. They're continuously learning from each other. They're adapting. They're, in some cases, they're, kind of stealing other people's ideas, or they're being inspired by other people's ideas. I mean, they talk. One of the great soccer coaches, Pep Guardiola, talks. He says, "I'm just a thief. I just go around and I take other people's ideas and I adapt them for myself." But most people actually don't do that. The really good ones, anyway, they don't. They see something and then they take something and they turn it into their own thing, and then they add to the knowledge, right?
Right.
And so the reason we're doing this is because we want to share different ideas with people and help them to find alternative solutions. So there's really no need to feel threatened by that if you're genuinely committed to your craft. If you are threatened by it, well, that's a sign that you're somebody who has got something that you're trying to protect. And there's a lot of dynamics there. It could be that you're trying to protect a livelihood, you're trying to protect a reputation, you're trying to protect might have, and that's all understandable and very human, but it should act as a bit of an alarm bell. So one of the kind of marks of any great coach, if you're out there and you are wanting to work with a coach and you're looking for a great coach, you should see somebody who's curious and open to different ideas and different ways of working. Also, what people don't understand is people think of great coaches as being the people who give you the knowledge and they're an expert and they've got lots of information and they tell you stuff.
Right.
Not a great coach, to be honest. A great coach is interested in you and what you're learning. They should definitely not be, they might give you some information, but they should be doing it far less than most people think. So they're important factors to consider. But the thing about the pad work and the bag work stuff is, it all depends. Everything's based on intent, right? Everything's fine. Everything's on the table, right? You can use your pads if you want to, as long as you understand what they're for and what they're best for. They're not best for skill acquisition and the learning of being a skillful fighter. Mm-hmm. What they might be useful for is physical training, a warm up. The very act of going through the motions of hitting something and the feeling of that, and going through the idea of the feeling of a certain way and all those sorts of things, moving around, cutting, all those sorts of things, fine, right? But understand that's what they're for. That's the value they have, right? Which is a relatively small part. So the issue isn't necessarily the use of pads, it's the overuse and the misperception that they are helpful in the development of movement skill. They are only one very small component in the development of movement skill, and in my opinion, should be like the seasoning on a meal, used sparingly, right? They should use far less than people think they are, particularly if we're interested in skill dynamics. So I guess that's the point I want to make, is that any of these methods, I'm not saying don't do them necessarily. I mean, I spend very little time in isolated movement work, really, because I haven't got very much time with my athletes anyway. And so I want to maximize the time I do have on things that I believe are going to help them to improve the most, even if it takes slightly long. Oh, and that's the other point to make here as well. When someone hits a bag or they hit pads, they feel like they're getting a good workout.
Mm-hmm.
and there's something out of it. But the reality is they're getting something that I describe as fool's gold. If you think you've got something in one session, in the world of skill and the dynamics of human movement, if you think in one session that you have perfected a movement, you are deluding yourself. It's fool's gold.
Yes.
What you've done is you've done something a few times and it feels like you've got a different movement. But I guarantee the minute you take that into a dynamic environment, it'll fall apart. Because skill acquisition is a slow, not painful, but slow process. And it requires a lot of dynamical movement that is not easy to unpick all the time. And sometimes it'll feel like you're not making much progress. But actually that kind of the pit of learning or the difficulty area is really where the richness is. And a lot of coaches are a bit fearful of people going into the zone of difficulty because they think that the individual will feel, oh God, I'm not making progress. Oh, what is this coach even telling me? So they keep everything on the surface level and they keep it easy and simple to keep everybody happy, going away with a smiling face.
Yeah.
People in the past, I used to evaluate my coaching sessions by people going away with a smiling face. Now I evaluate them by people going away slightly disgruntled. Then I know I've captured them a little bit and they've got something that they've taken away that's sort of eating away at their brain that they may want to continue to develop.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. And that's really because there's such a business incentive to teach in a very highly structured traditional way in martial arts, regardless of traditional or MMA or whatever. People are really afraid. First of all, they don't understand the fact that truly learning a movement is a long period. So you can't judge somebody's skill with a technique based on their performance in one class or one session. They don't understand how that works. But they also have that that business incentive where if they're not smiling and sweaty smiles and laughing and high fives and stuff when they walk away, now that's going to hit your retention. For adults, maybe for kids that could be the case, but for adults, I don't think that's the case. I know in jiu-jitsu a lot of times, some of the guys, they walked away very pensive, right? There's something going on in their game that they're mulling over in their head over and over again, trying to solve. And even though their experience wasn't super, their feelings weren't positive walking away, that's a retention mechanism insofar as they want to come back and test their hypothesis again. They want to solve it.
Yeah.
So sometimes I think maybe if you're stuck with somebody who's maybe very neurotic and you don't want to lose them as a student, maybe there is a trade-off between the traditional and the constraints led in terms of motivation management, right? Maybe you have to every once in a while come through and rebuild that confidence.
Just bear with me 1 second. Sorry.
Yeah.
It's on the top there. Sorry, my daughter has an essential request. Where is the iPad?
Yes.
It's the working from home scenario with no school. So there we go. Anyway, sorry about that.
No worries.
You're. Well, I would argue maybe I would look at it slightly differently, perhaps, which is I've sort of challenged myself not to go back to the traditional, what I had previously, and I've done that as a constraint on me because I know how to do that, and I don't really believe in it anymore anyway. But I could do that if I wanted to, but I've sort of tried to put a constraint on myself to say that would be a bit easy actually, and it's almost like I would probably never fully challenge myself to explore the different approaches because I'm really learning. Every day is a really rich learning experience now. Actually, coaching before was a bit boring. It was formulaic. It was very sterile.
Yeah,
and I didn't derive a great deal of joy from it. Whereas now I do. Every session has got something that's just very challenging and kind of rich. And it does require you to have a good degree of vulnerability to say that you don't know everything. And actually, I'm going to explore solutions with you, the learner. We're going to be together on this journey of exploring solutions together. And I'm just going to be your co-creator or co-partner. And any knowledge I have that I can use to sort of help you, I will. But so that's firstly, that's a fundamentally different conception of what the role is. It's not a teacher. I call it a sense maker. You're helping an individual to make sense of an environment that you're also in. So you take yourself from being on the top as the knower with the power and the controller to being somebody who's alongside the learner in the environment with them, with as much information as they have from perception. And you're going to help the individual by sharing your perceptions to help them sort of find clues. Now, if you look at it from that perspective and change the dynamics of what your role looks like, what I do is now say to people, so I wouldn't necessarily go to a traditional approach necessarily. What I would do is I would apply the constraints-led approach in a different way. So your point's a really good one, by the way, which is an individual may not resonate with it particularly well because of either their predominant psychological makeup or some emotional challenges or a range of factors that any
social programming
engage with. Oh God, yeah, that's a big one. Yeah. Give me the drills, please. I'm addicted to them.
Right.
So in that context, previous experiences are huge. Yeah. So, but then what you might then do is an application of a constraint-led approach in a slightly different way. So it's something that maybe is similar to where they've been before, but the application is slightly different. Now, my experiences so far have been that I have never ever experienced something where somebody has outright said to me, can we just do the really boring repetitive movement patterns again, please? Because I really need it. I really want it. And if I ever have had that, and I reckon I can count it on genuinely, maybe definitely on one hand, no more than that, I would very often say, I could do that, but what about if we did this instead? And they always go, oh no, that would be much better.
Yeah.
Or if I acquiesced ever and went into pure isolated movement pattern road, they very quickly came to the conclusion, actually, no, this is boring. Can we do something more exciting, please? So it's interesting. It's about application. And I do agree with you. You do need a very personalized application. Right. And that's probably one of the difficulties as well with anybody embarking on a kind of ecological conception of coaching or a constraints-led approach, is getting the application right is sometimes quite challenging. And I've definitely got it wrong. But you have to accept that and also be very honest with your athletes that if you're genuinely going to be responsive to their needs, you're probably going to get that wrong a couple of times because we haven't got the answers prescribed. We're not just pulling something straight out of a book. This is about dynamic learning in the environment, in the context. There's going to be a bit of ugliness there.
Yeah. Navigating, I guess, would be a great word for that.
Navigating is a great word. I use that as a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. Navigating it as opposed to simply leading you by the hand. Yeah. I guess that would be a great kind of, yeah. Yeah. So while you were talking, I had a breakthrough, and that is that that between the traditional mode of instruction and the constraints-led approach, you're not communicating necessarily less with the learner, but you're just communicating in a different way. So instead of using the learner's feeling about the learning experience, that session, as a way to keep them coming back, instead, their relationship with you as the coach can be a powerful retention mechanism insofar as you are opening their eyes to what's actually happening, right? You're letting them know, hey, you're going to be frustrated. That means you're in a good place, and we're going to work through this together. So keep working through this problem in your mind. So you kind of, I guess in a way, you're kind of undoing the damage that's done to people and their notion about education and learning that they are programmed with through, 18 years of school, coming up through traditional education and things like that. And you're starting to, in a way, implicitly train them to take more interest and more delight in the learning process, even insofar as appreciating their mistakes and their plateaus and things like that. Obviously, this is something I'm just now thinking about, so I'm kind of reaching for words to get my thoughts out. But I was wondering if if that sounded accurate to you in terms of the differences in communication between traditional instruction and constraints-led approach.
Yeah, and it's probably worth mentioning that whilst the constraints-led approach is, if you like, a way of designing learning environments or manipulating learning environments to help performers respond, and ecological dynamics or ecological approach or ecological psychology is a theoretical perspective that kind of oversees that and kind of is a lens through which to look at human adaptation, human development. And the one thing I'll say is, when you look at the world through an ecological lens, it's very hard to not look at it like that anymore.
Right.
You see it elsewhere as well, and you see the limitations of some learning approaches, school, etc., and it becomes you become extremely frustrated, quite quickly. So it's a bit of a blue pill, I'm afraid. But anyway, once you see, so you got the lens through which you look at it. You got constraints-led approach, which is a kind of way of governing the activity. But then what that doesn't take into consideration is how the individual human, as in the coach, needs to behave and interact within all that. So we have led to that, which is, it's not a coach-led approach. It's an athlete-led learning approach.
Yeah.
So that's something that I think people don't quite get, which is, I'm doing constraints, I'm asking some questions. It's performer-centered.
Right.
No, because you're still the knower, you're still the one with the power, you're still the one determining who does what, when, and how. Actually, if you're more athlete-led, then what you are is you're placing yourself as a learner inside the learning environment as well. And actually, the better learner you are, the more intuitive you are, the more in tune with what the athletes are experiencing you become. And you do have to use, I wrote a blog post about developing superpowers by shutting up, because my listening skills improved and my intuition improved. I sensed things weren't right. I can't quite describe what that is, and I couldn't possibly, but I just knew. So I was hearing things, I was seeing things, I was feeling things and sensing things that I probably hadn't sensed before. Why? I was too busy putting this barrage of noise into the space.
Right.
So by being quieter, I became more skillful, because I was more able to attune to what the performers were experiencing. So as I became more skillful, I didn't always necessarily need to solicit information from the athletes, because I was observing it. So what I would often do is solicit information from the athletes just to confirm that my suspicion was correct, to then make a change, or I would just make a change just to see how they adapt to that, because I could kind of pick up from the vibes on the field or wherever it was happening what was taking place. So if you want to, a genuinely skillful performance as a coach, if you think about this, right, if we're interested in human learning, skillful performance as a coach, you have to work in this way. You have to be in with the athlete. You have to be in their space and trying to derive what their experiences are. If you're just purely an instructor, and this will probably be where you get all the write-ins now, and I get a load of death threats, right? But if all you do is provide instruction, or it's the dominant paradigm that you use, well, anybody can do that.
Right.
That's not skillful, is it? That's purely and simply just transmission mode. And all I've got to do is read a couple of books, and I can tell people loads of stuff. And I'll seem expert, and they'll probably see me as expert because I've read a couple of books. But that's not coaching. That's not skillful coaching performance, but it's perceived as being. But those of us who really know what skillful performance looks like, it's the people who place themselves out of the picture, and their interventions are like rapiers, right? They're like, it's just very little, but it's just right on point, and the athlete just gets it. How many people experience that in their lives? Not many. But when you get it, when you experience it, it's the most powerful experience you'll ever have. And when you as a coach go in there and you know that you've just nailed it, there's no greater feeling. If you're in it just for yourself, right? And like the absolute thing, I get in. So I get in, and I'd love to do some research on coaching flow. I get into flow working in this way.
Yeah.
I'm in a struggle sometimes. It's the most difficult feeling, but you're in it and you're just kind of time disappears and I'm just there with the athlete and we're struggling at it and we're working through it together. And I just get into complete flow. And I've never, ever got into flow before. I was just purely following my script or looking at my notes and telling people what to do. It was just joyless experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've actually had friends, I talk with my friends about this stuff because if I didn't, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. So I bug them. So a lot of them teach martial arts. So, a lot of the initially what I've gotten is like, why would you if you're not giving all this information out, because this is a big problem in martial arts, is being the expert and giving all this information down from on high. If you're not giving all this information and you're not vomiting information on the student, anyone could just have them play the sport and get better at it. Like, what's the point of the constraints-led approach? I'm like, well, actually, when you really think about it, it requires a more skilled practitioner to do this constraints-led approach, because you have to understand the fundamental dynamics of the game. And you have to understand the different types of experiences that athletes have specifically in your sport.
Yeah.
In order to design learning experiences. You don't just toss them into skirmishes or sparring matches or whatever.
Yeah.
There's a lot of high level, almost abstract manipulation going on in terms of what you want to, the types of things you want to emerge in that environment, so that you can get good practice, quote unquote, reps to help build certain skills in your students. And that takes really a really extremely deep knowledge of the game itself. So you can learn the script of instruction, right? I've put them to, as a chief instructor in a dojang, as we call them, or that's the Korean for dojo. Before, I put those scripts together. I designed those scripts. They're not hard, right? Instructional systems are not very hard to put together to help new instructors know what to say and do in a given lesson. What's harder is to teach them how to, what you say, create dynamic environments and then dynamically adjust those environments to help the students by being attuned with the students. And I feel like this is something that really bothered me about instructors, because I didn't just teach. I've taught in a lot of places, and with instructors, even ones that were in places over me, one thing that bugged me a lot was the distance these traditional methods created between the instructor or the coach and their learners, their athletes, and how little they actually listened to their athletes as they tried on their own to give them some feedback about their experience, especially children. And for me, I started to listen to what the kids were saying. And not only did I get better at teaching them or coaching them or helping them, my relationship got better. The kids wanted to come in and tell me about their day. You know what I mean? So it got to the point where my kids, this is really weird too. When I was teaching in my own club a couple of years ago, it got to the point where my kids almost even never asked me about going up another belt. They just wanted to come in and talk to me about their day and do some taekwondo. I mean, they were just having fun and learning. And to them, and this is an accident really, but just because I was listening to them so much and really tailoring what I said back and how I structured the lessons in that way, it went from, hey, I want to work up through the belts and get to black belt, to, hey, I want to come in and hang out with Mr. Peacock. So it's, it changes, it fundamentally change. It seems to me like a constraints-led approach to coaching will fundamentally change your relationship with the learner and almost make it more intimate, more close. I don't know if that's been your experience, but
yeah. Oh no, without a doubt. I think that's a really astute observation, actually. I'm really glad you made it, which is, it definitely builds connection.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, an instructional approach means that it creates that distance necessarily, doesn't it? Because if you're essentially seeing a human being as a passive recipient of information, or somebody who should essentially behave because you said so, then there's a natural distance between an individual who is essentially saying do this and do that, and treating and objectifying, if you like, the performer, than an individual who is saying you and I, we're going places together and we're going to learn some stuff as we go, and I'm going to try and help you with whatever it is that you want to do, and be the kind of guide by the side, or whatever, or the navigator, or the sense maker, or whatever term you want to use.
Yeah.
Well, the two things are sort of diametrically opposed. What one is naturally more about, one's more about them, and the other one's more about you as the coach. And then immediately the other one, because it's almost about them, you build a bond and a connection straight away. And so connection, if you like, is a really beautiful and happy byproduct of taking a more athlete-led approach to human learning. And you make a good point. I mean, your podcast is combat learning, right? So
right.
It's an important point to make here, right? Which is, this is about learning, right? So this approach is about learning. Now, often what happens is people model what they see in the elite realm. So they model techniques they see in the elite realm, and they're used to justify their application in a different, like more recreational or learning context, let's say. If it's good enough for them, we'll do it over here. But you've got to understand that an elite athlete has done the learning, or at least has done a lot of learning already. Mm-hmm. So right. Their context is much more about either training or refinement. Okay. Whereas, but a more novice athlete or a more developing athlete, they're learning, right? So you want to make it information. The environment needs to be information rich, and it needs to involve, you both. So if you want to be a trainer, that's fine, and use trainer techniques. But understand that you're a trainer. You're developing physical movement. That's it, or physical capability. But if you want to be a genuine skill, someone who's interested in skill and skillful movement, then you're going to be much more in the learning space, and that's the difference. And so I think any pushback you get, I think often is from people who are saying often, but I'm, what they're basically saying is I'm a trainer. That's okay, and that's cool. And just don't dress yourself up as doing anything other than that. And that's the big problem I have, is that people think that they are, they're doing the learning and the skill acquisition because they're getting people to repeat movement patterns. No, what you're doing is you're getting people to be able to repeat movement patterns. That's different from skill. Technique is different from skill.
Ooh, that's a really good one. Technique is different from skill. That's gonna make some heads spin. Somebody's brain is gonna break as soon as they listen to this podcast.
People think that technique and skill are the same thing.
Well, so how would you differentiate them more in like in a pithy way?
Skill is a technique applied in context.
Okay, yeah. So that's the technical definition of skill in motor learning, right?
Well, generally speaking, if I ask a group of coaches, they actually arrive at that conclusion. But they assume that if you just do enough technique stuff, you'll get skillful eventually. Yeah. To a degree, maybe, right? But the approach to skillful performance, my view, in sort of an ecological conception or in skill acquisition literature, to be honest, is actually becoming skillful performer requires you to understand the combination of information and environment in order to be able to define action.
Yeah.
So it's like, and so just technique isolated technique development is, so skill is actually an emergent property based on environmental variables, not something you preordain and inject into somebody by doing movement patterns over and over again.
Right. So repetition does not lead to skill.
Bernstein's quote is repetition without repetition.
Right. So, but true. So, I think what I'm getting at is the sterile repetition does not lead to skill as you defined it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dead on.
Yeah. That's going to be a brain buster for, so like you said that coaches naturally get to this point. I think a lot of people who coach the sport aspect of martial art, yes. they get a lot of, they intuit a lot. There's another aspect especially in the traditional martial arts that is, I don't know how to say this nicely. These are my people, so I don't care what they think. There is an intellectual incest going on that is destroying their ability not only to understand these concepts, but to notice them implicitly. And I think with them, the idea that kicking 100 times in the air doesn't lead to skill with that kick, to them, that would be practically heresy, right? That would be like, are you kidding me? Like, how could you repeat a kick 1,000 times and not get skilled with that kick? But what they're not thinking of skill in the right, from the right vantage point, or from the right context. Like skill in this meaning your ability to use it in a performance context. So if you wanted to, I think you mentioned forms and kata earlier in the episode. That might count as skill from the vantage point or the context of competitive kata, but not in the context of fighting, self-defense, sparring, anything that has to do with interacting with another human being.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. If doing a kata brilliantly, then 100% do loads of them. But if it's something else, then you've got to do something else.
Yeah. So most of traditional martial arts is razor focused on building better skill for kata performance, your basics, your one steps, all that stuff. And very little of it is built for building into the dynamic fighting, sparring, competition side of it. And getting very, very traditional old school, especially old school guys to understand this is, for me, surprisingly difficult. We go round and round and round and we end up in the same place. And no matter how much I refine my language and the way I try to they create their own language taxonomies too, which makes it a little difficult to unpack as well. And so no matter how I try to adjust my communication style and talk about some of the research and try to talk about some of the concepts and the differences and things like that, it just, one or two of them will finally get it, and we can have some fruitful conversation, and the rest of them kind of just stay burrowed into the whatever it was their master taught them. You know what I mean? So it's that's tough. But that's why I started this podcast. It's really to get other people from outside my direct community to come in and really weigh in on this and get people more acquainted with the literature with the science and what's it's starting to say about how we can better teach and learn. But go ahead.
Every sport has its own every sport and every domain has its own culturally resilient beliefs.
Right.
And sort of working against some of those culturally resilient beliefs can be really, really difficult and really, really challenging. But it's kind of how human beings progress. It's how we make progress.
Sure.
As a species, if you like. And the fact that we be able to broadcast messages more readily is so powerful, because previously this was done hand to mouth, or mouth to mouth, face to face, mouth to mouth. Very, very little of this information was provided. So it's no surprise, in what is a relatively new medium of information sharing, which is facilitated by online, that people are now beginning to understand alternatives and not just take what they were taught and stick with what they were taught. But it takes a particular open mind, and you have to recognize you're not going to reach everybody. So I'm happy with that. I just know that I get messages sort of every week of people saying to me, I had one come the other day. It was just somebody saying to me, look, not only have you helped me as a coach, but you've helped me as a father. Well, to be honest, it's a challenge putting a podcast out, as you probably know, but that for me is the reward that you seek, isn't it?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. My podcast is pretty small right now, but I've had a couple guys reach out and be like, man, this is really helpful. And like, thank you for putting this out. Like, there's nothing like this out there. And that was the purpose. And then other guys that have been in this space, but have been isolated. They're like, wow, somebody out there is actually thinking about this and trying to put this out there. I thought I was the only one. And both of those for me are really validating, because I thought I was the only one, right? I had to bug my friends to get in on this so I could talk to them about it. And now I'm finding there's not an army of them out there, but now I'm finding there are these guys, and some of them I've discovered on your podcast. I haven't talked to all of them, but people that are in the martial arts that are thinking about this, that are doing research on this stuff and thinking about it and trying to figure out how it works in practice. And that's been the real magic of the podcast, because when I was writing articles on this stuff, a couple of years ago, really just starting to work my thoughts out on transitioning out of a traditional framework, I didn't get hardly any engagement. And what I did get was super frustratingly negative. So the podcast has actually proved to be a much better medium for communicating.
You can get the nuance across more readily, can't you?
Yeah, I think people don't see me as a charlatan because they can hear my voice. And there's more that you can kind of, like you said, nuance. There's more stuff you can kind of add offhand really quickly that doesn't work very well if you want to be a skilled and concise writer. There's just stuff you have to cut out so that people aren't hit with too much of a cognitive load. But yeah, it's proved to be a much better communication medium. But yeah, I want to be we've been on here a long time. I want to be respectful of your time, but there's one more thing I wanted to run by you. That's more of me working through the constraints-led approach before we wrap this up, and that is I've been thinking about Daniel Coyle's book. I think it's Daniel Coyle, The Talent Code, and feedback loops, right? And something he said was that one of the reasons that he observed why these talent hotbeds started producing such incredibly talented athletes that dominated in competition was because they were able to build tighter feedback mechanisms that let the learners kind of try, fail, and develop better solutions in quicker cycles. Yeah. And I was trying to think about how we could do this with I practice a lot of martial arts. I do a lot of jiu-jitsu, but my main style has always been Taekwondo. So for me, when I get back into coaching Taekwondo, I wanted to find a way to apply that to my Taekwondo training, or to my students' Taekwondo training. And you mentioned before about the smaller octagon, and what I want to do is there's nothing out there like this, so I'd have to kind of build something of my own, but build kind of an adjustable ring that makes the ring smaller, but you can adjust it. So if you want a little bit more range, you can adjust it out and give a little bit more range. And if you want to kind of almost force like clinch working from the clinch and trying to move her in that area, you can bring it down in as close as you need to for that. And I was wondering if that would, and actually so my rationale for this was that there was actually a study, and I don't remember the author, on Taekwondo that found that when Taekwondo athletes are sparring in the dojang, they stay a longer distance from their opponent. But when they're in competition and they need to score points to win, they're not just training, they tend to stay in a closer range. And for me, that seems like if they're spending so much time outside of that range and training, that their training is not optimized to help them navigate that range that they're in. So I wanted to find a way to naturally change the environment such that they are forced to stay in that range without me yelling at them to stay in that range, or without me doing something that's really too artificial. So where they don't have to think about, all they have to do is kind of use their perception of, oh, I don't want to hit, I don't want to hit this barrier, so I need to stay here. So they're going to naturally adjust their. I was wondering what you thought about that, like if that would be useful for solving the problem of staying within the range that might be more useful for them to be able to navigate in order to score points.
Yeah, I mean, using a constraint like space would be definitely something that, so for example, putting them in a really small ring where there's very little movement, very little opportunity to move, apart from maybe a little bit of movement forward and backwards perhaps, and very little movement sideways, might be an interesting way of doing that. And it doesn't have to be like a proper ring necessarily with the resistance that it gives. It's just, you're just going to create a space artificially using whatever you've got around you. And just to say you've now got a spa or kind of conditioned spa or whatever it might be in that little environment. That's one way. Another way might just be to for example, create a rule, like a task rule, whereby you have to maintain some form of physical contact with each other of some kind, whatever it might be, or it might be they're not allowed to go beyond a certain distance apart, whether it's a foot or whatever it is. And if you move outside of that realm from each other, then you lose a point. Or to use areas on the ground, like, marked out. I mean, kind of an Olympic Taekwondo ring is circular, I believe, is it not?
It is. So it used to be rectangular. It is now more like an octagon, I think. They changed the shape of it. But you could, it doesn't have natural barriers. It's really easy just to step out of bounds.
So you could put markers on the ground of some kind that basically just constrain the space that you could operate within along similar lines. Or I was thinking potentially you could use like an elastic bungee, as long as it wasn't too limiting in movement. So you were actually physically tied to each other. And there's a degree of elasticity in terms of movement, but only so much. These are just exploratory ideas that I'm throwing at you, but all of these are constraints in different ways. But fundamentally, the key bit is not necessarily to change the space in order to bring them into closer contact as such. It's to get them to understand what's the difference. So what you'd want to also do is to extend out the space as well. So I quite often set up sessions where there's a very small pitch and there's a bigger pitch and then there's a bigger pitch and there's a smaller pitch. And I want them to understand what's the difference in terms of what you can do when you're in these different spaces. That's the fundamental learning moment there. So it's about them understanding the spatial difference by comparing bigger space versus smaller space, for example, as opposed to just purely and simply fighting in a smaller space, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I don't really want to keep them there because I want, there's outside fighters and stuff like that. So I want people to be able to develop the skill of using the entire ring if that's where they want to be. But there's also the idea that they tend to stay closer in a match. So they're not quite as equipped to navigate that range. Maybe that's my concern. It's something I'm working through, obviously, and I'm not teaching right now, so I can't really test everything. But I definitely wanted to get your perspective on that, and that's really helpful. Really helpful.
You're definitely on the right lines, though.
Yeah.
I think it would need a bit of tweaking to try and find the right blend, but once you got it, you got it.
Sure. Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on, man. This has been a really, really information-rich, really valuable episode, I think, and I've really enjoyed it.
And no, I'm glad we could do it, and I'm glad hopefully that it'll maybe help some other people to maybe explore some alternative approaches. Be really interested to hear how people get on, to be honest. So if they wanted to drop me a line or there's some questions that they pose, I'll be happy to respond. I can't immediately, but take me a little while. But I'm happy to get people to come back to me on that if they've got any thoughts.
Yeah, for sure. I'll put your information in the liner notes, but if you wanted to tell people on the podcast right now where they can lead you, get in contact with you, go ahead.
Yeah, so the show's all available on all good podcatchers, the Talent Equation, and also the website is thetalentequation.co.uk. And you can find me on Twitter. I am at Stu_Arm. And I'm not as active, but I definitely respond to messages and share the odd thing I see from time to time. I try not to get involved in spats with people who are busily trying to tell me that drills are a really essential part of any coaching repertoire, because I find that you just get nowhere. So it's much their own conclusions. And actually, on that note, as I mentioned earlier on, I had a child come to say that she wanted to grab hold of the iPad, which is an alarm bell. So I had to go and find out what's going, because it means she's stuck to a screen. And also, I've got to go out coaching this evening. So,
all right.
I'd love to talk more, but I'm a little bit more tied up as concerned.
All right. Well, I will let you go. Thanks again for coming on.
No problem at all.
All right. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to the Combat Learning Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. It really helps us out. Finally, this episode, including the intro music, is produced by Micah Peacock. Thanks in advance, and I'll see you on the next episode.